Hello, everybody. I'm going to, oh, sorry, hold on. Okay, whoops. Okay, hello, everybody. Can everyone hear me? Lisa, can you guys hear me?
Yeah, you're sound great.
Great. Oh, perfect. Thank you very much. Thank you all for coming tonight. This is a program of ASU Jewish Studies, which serves as an intellectual resource for all aspects of Jewish experience, from philosophical and political viewpoints to the study of Judaism. Through undergraduate and graduate courses, research conferences, public lectures, and more, we are committed to fostering critical inquiry as well as disseminating accurate information about Jewish culture and enhance the quality of Jewish life in Phoenix metropolitan area and around the world. I'm Stanley Mirvis. I'm the Harold and Jean Grossman Chair of Jewish Studies here at ASU. I specialize in 18th century Jewish history. So we're going to spend a lot more time in the 18th century than is probably warranted for that reason, in case you're wondering. And tonight we'll be talking a little bit about revenge fantasy in the Megillat Esther, in the Esther Scroll, and in the practice of Purim through an historical lens. Okay, and a trigger warning here. We're gonna look at some pretty violent imagery. So if that bothers anybody, just to be aware of that. Let's see if this is, there we go. Okay, so first of all, just a little bit of context if we're not sure about what Purim is or what the Megillat Esther is. The Megillat Esther is a story that is set in the Achaemenid Persian era, but partially against the backdrop of the Achaemenid expansion into various provinces in the Near East, including the restoration of the satrapy of Yehud, where these in the story of Esther, there is a wicked man called Haman, who is able to influence a very kind of stupid and blustering king who doesn't have a lot of convictions, but is easily malleable to issue a decree to kill the Jews. The Jewish hero, Mordecai, uses his probably his niece, it's not clear from the text, and there are different textual midrashic traditions about what the relationship is. His niece Esther to enter into the palace and use her sexual charms to effect a rescue of the Jewish people. In the end of the story, the original decree that had been issued throughout Persia to kill the Jews was reversed, and instead the Jews are given the right and to kill the Persians instead. So because of that, there is this sense of revenge fantasy and vindictive violence that permeates the Megillah. Now, this text is possibly Hasmonean in origin, so written in the Hellenistic period, which, like the Book of Daniel or maybe Ecclesiastes, so therefore reflecting a more of a political situation that's more relevant to the Maccabean War, possibly. And one really important theme of the Megillat Esther is that Haman, the wicked antagonist, is a descendant of the Amalekites who had attacked the Bnei Yisrael, the children of Israel, in the desert of Sinai at the Battle of Rephidim. They had sneak attacked them and attacked them from behind, right? So they are, in Jewish tradition, they are both an ethnic descendant people, the Amalekites, but also they later on, especially in modernity, the term Amalek takes on more of a cultural meaning to mean just any kind of embodiment of evil. So the Book of Esther is very much connected to the 5 books of Moses and Deuteronomy, wherein the children of Israel are given the mitzvah, the commandment to kill and eradicate the Amalekites from the planet. So the Book of Esther is only, in a way, a fulfillment of that original decree in Deuteronomy. So that is some of the main themes here. It's really important when we're talking about revenge fantasies of any minority group. Really, revenge fantasy is a tool used by any disaffected or dispossessed or subaltern group in order to imagine a world in which they are not the persecuted, but are the persecutors. So revenge fantasy isn't something that is specific to the Jews, but it is something that is pervasive throughout any kind of subaltern group or colonized group. And the idea of Amalek is very interesting because it takes on the context of just evil, completely disconnected from any of the descendants of the Agagites or the descendants of Amalekites. So a good example of this in our own context of the United States is the great founder, one of the founders of Reformed Judaism in America, David Einhorn, who had taken a stance against slavery during the Civil War, one of the very few Jewish abolitionists. And it's not because Jews were against the idea of abolition, but really were repelled by abolitionism because of its anti-Semitic rhetoric. And so one of the very few rabbis that did ascribe to abolitionism, who was run out of his home in Baltimore for the very reason of his hard stance against slavery, who found himself in Philadelphia, and in 1864 delivered a sermon in a synagogue in Philadelphia where he called the slaveholding Confederates the Amalekites. So in that sense, the term Amalek, this becomes this, whatever is the embodiment of evil in the world that you live in. But in the Esther story, of course, it's Haman and his sons and his wife. Okay, so, but not so much the king, Ahasuerus, who I think is kind of almost a comedic foil in the text. Now, some of the major themes of the text that are important to Bible scholars and others is the idea of femininity as a powerful force. This is both true of Esther, but maybe even more so for Vashti, the queen of the original queen of Ahasuerus, who has a lot to teach about consent and who defies the king. So a lot of feminist scholarship has centered around that character in the Book of Esther. The idea of an olam hafuch, of an upside down world. The decree was to kill the Jews, and in turn, the Jews have a decree to kill the Persians. In the end, the world is reversed. The idea of this is a nes nistar, that God has no role in this text. God is not mentioned in this text. A completely human drama. And nakama, vengeance, is a big deal, obviously, in the Purim story. So the idea of hiddenness is something that we might not have a chance to return to, but just think about how important that is for some groups of Jews throughout history. For instance, the conversos paid special attention to the role of Esther in the Bible and her hiddenness. After all, Esther hid her identity, and she went into the palace of the king, and in doing that, in that action of hiding her identity, she is able to redeem the Jewish people. And if that's not a powerful message to conversos who had hidden their identity, those that had remained as crypto Jews, then what would be? And in fact, this is very well documented in Inquisition records. One of quite common aspects of crypto Jewish practice was to keep the fast of Esther. Sometimes the fast of Esther for 3 days, as it's described in the Book of Esther, as opposed to the one-day fast as it's done in Jewish diasporas in the early modern period and today. So Esther becomes a very critical, central figure. It's someone that the conversos had access to. And similarly, Sabbatians later on put special emphasis on Esther, again, because of her hiddenness as a redemption of the world. Okay, so that's some of the ways that the Megillat Esther has permeated historically throughout Jewish history. Now, if you're unfamiliar with Purim as a holiday, so Purim derives its name from the lots that were thrown and to determine the day on which the Jews would be slaughtered in the Persian Empire. So Purim becomes quite a central holiday for the Jews for this reason, where the central feature really is reading the Book of Esther. And later on, you'll see that there's some debates about whether or not Purim should exist at all, especially among the Reform movements, if Purim was too raucous or too full of vindictiveness to be a fitting Jewish holiday, or if it should be reformed. Those are some of the debates that happen later on. But let's say Purim is not a holiday without its controversies within the Jewish cycle of the year. But some of the traditional practices of Purim include fasting on the day before, preceding the Megillah reading, a 12-hour fast, reading Esther Scroll, usually twice, gift giving, that's mishloach manot, gift giving of 2 edible items, alms givings, matanot le'evunim, eating a festive meal, and reciting Dalamisim prayer for holidays. And some of the cultural practices, so not really rooted in particular law, but things that are that have permeated Jewish cultural life are things like the Purim spiel, which is very important, one of the very few avenues and outlets that Jews had for dramatic expression before the 18th century, really, in especially in Central Europe. So Purim spiel, the kind of raucous and hilarious satirical comedies that are part of the practice of Purim are deeply embedded in Jewish culture. Drinking alcohol is a big part of it. After all, this is kind of a Jewish carnival. And in fact, that's how it was described by non-Jews in Italy in the early modern period, particularly because it usually falls during Lent. So it is not only a carnival, but it is an offensive carnival from the Christian perspective. But drinking is obviously a big part of that. Burning effigies to Haman or other kinds, sometimes associated with desecration of Christian symbols as well. And because sometimes in Jewish diasporic life, Christianity becomes associated with the Amalekites as well. And of course, rioting, noise making, and just otherwise raucous behavior. All of these are part of Purim. And in fact, there's been some really interesting research about Purim celebrations in the West Indies in the 18th century. And according to one scholar, in Purim in Suriname in the 18th century, the carnival became an Afro-Creole festival where African descendant people, both slaved and freed people of color, would very much participate in the Purim parades, where alterity becomes a major feature, Jews dressing up as slaves or Jews dressing up as Indians or sailors, things like that. And so costume wearing, a way of identifying the hiddenness of the theme of hiddenness in the Megillat Esther is, and part of a carnival masquerade is a very important part. And here you see a 16th century image originally from Venice and then reprinted in the 17th century in Amsterdam of how important the costume culture is on Purim. Okay, now, oh dear, let's see. Make sure you can see all this. Now, oops, I can go back here. Computer, there we go. So let's, I want to talk about some of the moments when, and historically speaking, when Jewish noise-making and rioting really got out of hand, and the way, some of the historical implications of Purim celebrations throughout time. Now, this is not an exhaustive list, but it's a kind of quick list of certain examples. So in Catalonia, this is being blocked here, I can't stop it. But in Catalonia, oh my gosh, that's not good. Having some problems here with everyone with me here? Stand by.
Yeah,
Okay, in the late 13th century, oh my gosh, here we go. In the 1290s, there was a major event in Catalonia. So that's really the region that we would think of as Aragon in the Middle Ages. And charges were brought against the Jews for excessive disruptions during Purim. So that tells you that even in the late 13th century, sometimes the Purim celebrations became so boisterous that they had ramifications among their non-Jewish neighbors that they lived under. In 1306 in Provence, this is an interesting case because in this case, the Jews of this particular town waited till the holiday of Purim in order to flog a man who had been caught having relations with a non-Jewish woman. And he was flogged on Purim and then paraded naked through the Jewish quarter. So this is interesting because, this event didn't take place, the actual offense didn't take place on Purim, but the fact that they waited to Purim in order to do this tells you something about the expectations of what you can get away with on Purim, which on a normal day you might not be able to. So here's a little more long-term thing starting in 1640, and then really every decade subsequent to that in Amsterdam in the communal minutes, you find the communal board, the Ma'amad, consistently issuing a takana, an ordinance against excessive hammering and noise making. It was first of all, they were damaging the property of the synagogue, and especially after 1675 when they built a really beautiful synagogue, they didn't want to have to repair the synagogue after every Purim, but also it had become a point of offense to the non-Jews. So this was an attempt of the Ma'amad, of the communal board, to ensure that the Jews were practicing a certain standard of decorum so as not to offend the non-Jews under which they lived. In 1715, in Piedmont in Italy, there was a case when Jews were sanctioned for excessive noisemaking on Purim. Again, in 1751, the same time, by the way, that Frederick the Great also issued some ordinances against excessive noisemaking that seemed to be targeted against Purim celebrations. But again, in Piedmont, Jewish actors in a Purim spiel were arrested because they were being satirical and having a good time wearing costumes during Lent. And in 1756, in Sugenheim in Bavaria, Jews were prohibited from wearing masks and the clown suits. But interestingly, the ordinance states that they're also prohibited from carrying their torches at night. So you could derive from that what you will, but clearly that was a part of the Purim celebrations and parades. And then probably the most famous of all these incidents, in 1783, the London Communal Board of Bevis Marks, the Portuguese community in London, issued an ordinance that forbade noise making in the synagogue. And about 14 of the different congregants at Bevis Marks refused to adhere to these noise-making standards. So they made excessive noise in defiance of the law. So the Ma'amad had no recourse but to call the police, or the precursors to the modern police. And so the law keepers showed up at the synagogue and arrested these men, some of whom were very important, like Joshua Montefiore, who's, by the way, someone I've written a lot about, just parenthetically, but he was the uncle of Moses Montefiore, was arrested, and they had to later issue public apologies. But this was the closest thing to a Purim riot that you've ever seen. It spilled out into the street. And there are some similar accounts happening in places like Suriname when Purim celebrations became so out of hand that local law officials had to become involved. Now, I want to spend some time also talking about the idea of a Purim Sheni, or a Purim Katan, of the local Purims. So there is the Purim that is connected to the Book of Esther, which all Jews practice. But there's also local Purims that are days that are established in response to any event in which it's felt that Jews have been redeemed from a certain danger. That's the essence of the story of the Megillat Esther, that Jews are facing some certain disaster, and then through divine or otherwise means, they are rescued from that inevitable demise. So it's traditional to establish a Purim. Now, this is particularly popular in the Mediterranean, around the Mediterranean, especially the Eastern Mediterranean, but there's also some of these local Purims in German lands as well. And I'll just quickly go through some of the more famous ones. And I'll just also issue the caveat that this is not an exhaustive list, by the way. And also not all of these were actually practiced as Purims, especially the first one, which the only evidence for it was a poem written by Shmuel Nagid Samuel ibn Agrela, who led Islamic armies in the Taifa state of Granada in the 11th century. And when he defeated, at the head of an Islamic army, the Jewish vizier Ibn Agrela defeated a warlord representing Almeria and his Islamic Slavic slaves, that he penned a war poem in which he called the event a Purim. So does that make it an event that was celebrated, or was it just a literary device? That's something that we don't really know, or probably can never know. But in a similar situation is the Purim of Narbonne, in which case what happened in 1236, a Jewish man killed a non-Jewish fisherman, and then the accusation was that the non-Jewish physician let him die so that it would look like the Jew killed him. So he died from the wounds afflicted by the Jew. And there was some violence against the Jews, and Narbonne had been a very important site of Jewish settlement going back to the very early Middle Ages, where a large segment of the city was Jewish, possibly even with Jewish leadership, something like a Nasi from a very early period. So very important city in Jewish history. But the local baron stepped in and returned the Jewish property and stopped the violence against the Jews. On that day, the 21st day of Adar, a Purim was established so that every year the commemoration of their redemption would be remembered. And another more complicated one is the Purim of Saragossa, or Syracuse in Sicily, or Zaragoza in Catalonia. It's not exactly clear which place they're talking about. This is an interesting debate in itself. But apparently there is, for each of these Purims, or almost all of these Purims, there's their own Megillah, there's their own scroll describing the events in the same kind of cadence in which the events of Esther are described in the Esther Scroll. And in this case, what had happened is a local magistrate had asked the Jews to parade their Torah scrolls in their cases whenever he came by. And so the Jews felt it offensive to do so they would empty I'm going to try something new when this light goes off. I've got the flag of Bermuda here. Oh, let's get it. There we go. That kind of worked. Okay. So I'm coming up with all kinds of creative solutions when the lights go off. Now, so where was I? Yes. They would parade the Torah scrolls empty in boxes, because it was offensive to actually bring the Torah scrolls. But then a apostate, a Jewish convert to Christianity, told the magistrate what they were doing. But before the magistrate could find out, Elijah appeared to the community in a dream and told them to put the Torah scrolls back in the boxes. And so when the magistrate checked, he found that the scrolls were there and they were saved. And so it was celebrated as a Purim on the 17th of Shvat. Okay, that's a pretty mythological one, but a real one is historically one that's rooted in historical events. Is the events of Cairo in 1524, when there was a rebellion against the Ottoman Empire, and Ahmed Pasha tried to create an independent state in Egypt. It didn't last very long. When the Ottomans, in order to create this independent state, he extorted Jews and local Christians, but it didn't last for very long. When the Ottomans finally marshaled enough force, they put down Ahmed Pasha and they beheaded him, and the Jews celebrated this as a Purim because it looked like it would be bad news for them if he had reigned for any longer. Another very interesting event happened in Candia in Crete, described by the chronicler Elijah Kapsali, in which case violence was averted. This was happening as when Crete was under the Venetians and the Ottomans were encroaching on Crete. The Jews were accused of in their quarter harboring spies for the Ottomans, and Elijah Kapsali describes it as a Purim because all the young men were out digging trenches for the war effort. Therefore, they weren't in the town in order to start a war against the Venetians when they came looking for these Ottoman spies. So that was the miracle of Purim. And also there's a feminine aspect here. The women that were left in the town wailed and they made the Venetians go away. Celebrated as a Purim on the 18th day of Tammuz. Hope this is interesting. I'm going to give you a couple more. The Purim of Edom, which is Algeria. This was when Charles V, who of course was a great persecutor of Jews in a way. I mean, he was the ruler over Iberia, but also a lot of other parts of the world where there wasn't an inquisition. But to the Jewish mind, this spelled certain disaster if he had taken over Algeria from the Ottomans. But when he failed to do so, it was enacted as a Purim. Okay, a couple more. This is local Purims continued. In Rome, in 1555, this is a little bit of an ironic one because it's the same year that Jews were ghettoized under the Cum Nimbus Absurdum bill of Pope Paul IV. So the fact that Jews were also celebrating their own local Purim in this year is quite interesting. But the events leading to this Purim is the true killers of a child were found out and prosecuted, therefore averting a certain ritual murder accusation. Similarly, in Morocco, what the Saadin dynasty had succeeded and what the Watazids had never succeeded in doing, which was unseating the Portuguese from the western flanks of Morocco. And when they defeated the King Sebastian, finally in 1578, the famous Battle of Three Kings, the Jews were very excited to be living under exclusively Moroccan rule and not to worry about living under the Portuguese for good reason. Celebrated as a Purim. In Verona, in 1605, Jews established a Purim for having entering the ghetto, as opposed to being exiled from the city, expelled from the city. And now moving to German lands, in between 1412 and 1414, there was a major populist uprising in Frankfurt, in which Jews were targeted by Vincent Fettemilch. And then when the aristocrats came back and they reestablished rule over Frankfurt and they executed Fettemilch, who had persecuted Jews, they established a Purim in 1614. Same thing in Padua. Jews were accused of colluding with the Ottomans in Hungary, and so in Padua they also they were going to attack the Jews for this, but they were instead protected by the local parliament. And Ancona, on the Turnian side of Italy, which is a very important part of Jewish history just in general, but Jews survived a major earthquake. The Jewish quarter was spared, so Purim was established in 1690. Now, moving to more modern local Purims. So those local Purims aren't exactly connected to revenge fantasy per se, but they are connected to the idea of there being a redemption of the Jewish people in the face of certain disaster. But now some local Purims do have the element of revenge fantasy, and the most famous of them probably is the Purim Hitler, the Hitler Purim of Morocco. So when the Allies liberated North Africa in Operation Torch, and particularly in Morocco in 1944, which wasn't exactly a great event for every Jew living in North Africa, because what it also meant is that some Vichy regimes took control in places like Algeria, so it wasn't much better. But when the Nazis were defeated in North Africa, especially in Morocco, a local Jewish Hebraist composed this Megillat Hitler. And it's a really amazing document. It commemorates the Nazi surrender to the Allied powers in World War II. And it's written in the same language, in the same cadence, with the same kind of good humor as the Purim, the Megillat Esther. So just to give you a little taste of like the cadence. So if you're familiar with hearing the Megillat Esther, this will sound very familiar to you. But it's meant as a kind of tongue-in-cheek Purim Torah, and it was in the days of Hitler, Achashverosh, as the actual Megillah begins, and it was in the days of Hitler, the painter. He was the corporal who dictated over all Germany. In the first year of his dictatorship, he made a feast for his Nazis and for all his fellows. The army of Germany, the villainous Nazis, and the chiefs of the fascists that were before him. And they killed by the sword men and boys, and starved elders and children, and afflicted parents and trampled children. And they placed upon them hard labor, and exiled them from their homes, and stole their wealth, and captured their captives. And the Jews began to flee from the rage of their enemies, and left all that was theirs, and fled as captives before the stress and the rage of Hitler was not satisfied. So you could very much hear this in the same trope as the Megillat Esther is read. Here you see the names of the various officers, Nazi officers that surrendered to the Allies. They take the place of Haman's children that are hung upon the tree. Et Haman. And that's what you see here, one of the most classic themes of illuminated Megillot scrolls, Megillot Esther, scrolls of Esther, is the scene where Haman and his children, his 10 children, 5 on each side, are hung on a tree. And so this is really, now we're moving into the vindictive aspects of Purim. It's not enough that they had died. This is probably the most ubiquitously depicted element of the Purim drama. So the fact that it has such a strong resonance in Jewish iconography throughout the ages, and we're going to look at a whole bunch of examples right now. So again, a trigger warning. Then you'll be able to see just how powerful this ramification is. This is the day when the Jews can finally live up to the standards of Deuteronomy and eradicate the Amalekites from the earth, and affect a fantasy of revenge for all their persecution. And because of that fantasy, when the children of Haman are hung upon the tree, they always take on the same dress and the same styles and appearances as the society in which is persecuting the Jews at the time that the Megillah scroll was made. So we're gonna, and that's not uncommon. That's a similarity with some depictions in Haggadot. That's just not to mention that most of the artists are probably not Jewish, with some few exceptions. But they are being patroned by a Jew who commissioned the writing of the Megillah and the painting of the Megillah. But here you see two late medieval depictions from the Rhineland of the hanging of Haman's children, and they very much look like they are 13th century Christians. All right, now if we move a little forward, here's Venice in the 17th century, and in fact, they look quite similar, maybe to Ottomans. Given that in the 17th century, the great threat to Venice, more than anybody, were the Ottomans. So that might explain why these the embodiments of evil depicted as being Ottomans. Um, Here's a specifically Jewish artist, by the way, that we actually know. He was commissioned to make three Megillot that have survived, at least as far as we know, as far as I know, in Ferrara in 1617. And here again, you see some quite graphic scenes of vengeance, beheading. Here you see the king, King Ahasuerus is here, and this is Vashti being beheaded before your very eyes. And then Haman is being hung, and here is Queen Esther. All right, now we move into Vienna in the 18th century. Most of these will be from the 18th century. The hanging of Haman's children, quite graphic. Here you see them hung on the scaffolds, the gallows. Here they're hung on the trees. If you can't make that out, here they are. And here again, this kind of a gallows. This is something that Jews would see on Purim. Here are some German land from the 18th century Megillot Esther. Here's Haman, who's Talui al Ha'etz. He is hung upon a tree. And here are his sons again, being hung, being hanged. Sorry, and also here he is, and he's pretty relaxed about the whole thing. He's smoking a pipe. Here, a little bit more of a ornate iteration of this from Poland in the 18th century. Here you see the scene where Haman, there's an olam hafuch, a reversal of fortunes, in which Mordecai rides upon the horse and Haman leads the horse. So these are some scenes. But of course, the dress and the mannerisms, even the weapons, everything here is of the 18th century. And then the hanging scene. Okay, and then there's a very specific aesthetic that comes out of the Portuguese world in Amsterdam and Hamburg and London, and so you can these are really interesting, I think, because you can really see the similarities and the aesthetic of the Portuguese. Jews had really had a unique path towards European society. These are they appear very similar, possibly the same artist even. And of course the hanging scene. This one has a little bit of violence on the bottom here, but this is also quite interesting for the revolutionary type of imagery. This is from Venice, but it's really at the time, it's from the late 18th century, at a time of revolution, so you can kind of see liberty up here. Kind of reigning over, and ultimately, what is this? The hanging of Haman and his children, other than justice, which is probably what this is trying to convey. This is a really funny one, I think. If you really don't like clowns, this is probably the Megillah scroll for the Megillat Esther for you. But here's one from the Hebrew Union College in Cincinnati that depicts them. Really, it's more of the carnival aspect of Purim. They're not really depicted as real people, but as clowns. Again, if you have a phobia of clowns, which I've heard is a thing that people have, then this is probably could be a cathartic and healing thing for you. This is a really interesting scroll of Esther because this imagery, the front page of this classic 18th century German scroll of Esther was copied and then reprinted over again. So in the 1920s in the United States, probably the most common version of the printed Megillah that you would find in a synagogue when you went to go hear the Megillah read on Purim, you will find this image printed on the front of it. So this is an image that really had a lot of resonance, and it's quite brutal. in the hanging here. If you can kind of make that out here and here, but it's an imagery that resonated well into the 20th century. Now, this one is from Mandate Palestine, and they are it obviously depicts in certain ways a kind of colonial aesthetic. The dress of the persecutors are very much like reminiscent of British imperial soldiers. So there's that element here too. Again, reflecting whoever the embodiment of evil is in the time becomes Haman. This is probably the most famous of all of these, but I think it's bears mentioning here. The very famous illustrator Arthur Szyk. This is not the place to talk about him, but he's deeply important to Jewish history, and American history. But an absolutely prolific and amazing illustrator. He had one of the first things he had illustrated was the Megillat Esther in the 1920s, and then in 1950 that publication of the Megillah was revised so that the Haman character could be Nazified and turned into Nazis, and so that's what you're seeing here. Haman, who's being here, you see him making the blessing for the Megillah reading, and here is the Nazi Haman being hung with all these Nazi kind of iconography, especially the swastikas, all over his clothing. So that tells you, of course, about the embodiment of evil in the Jewish mind. And amazingly, Arthur Szyk also put himself into the image, eating a Ozne Haman, or Ozan Haman, or Hamantashen, the ear hat of Haman. And then here's where I'll end, and we could have more of a discussion for a while. This is an image I just found from a workshop online of a modern Israeli artist, and I felt that this was fascinating because the imagery here suggests that there's a kind of reimagining of the Persian elements of the persecutors in this revenge fantasy, which resonates for possibly modern Israelis as well, and vilification of Iran as being now the embodiment of Amalek, and the ancient Persians as they're depicted in the story of the Haggadah. So I think that I didn't mean the Haggadah, I meant the Megillah. And so, but that's an interesting mistake to make, because they're both similarly important in their iconography and illuminations. So I think that this tells you a lot about how we envision evil through the lens of the Megillat Esther. And I'm happy to stop now, and we can take some questions and have some discussion if you care to. But first, before we do that, I also want to let you know that on March 27th, from 9 a.m. till 6:15 p.m., Jewish Studies will be hosting its annual Jewish Science and Medicine Group Conference. So bringing together scholars from all over the world, from America, from Israel, some of the greatest minds working in public health from a Jewish perspective, including some historical content as well, to speak about Jewish responses to pandemic. And so the overall theme is Jewish public health, and we very much encourage you to sign up and register online through the Jewish Studies website. So thank you very much for your attention, and I very much look forward to hearing some of your thoughts.
So this is Lisa. I'm going to jump in with the first question. So typically we know Purim is celebrated on the 14th day of Adar. But when you were talking, you kept using the word Purim as a noun to describe these celebrations, or I'm just wondering if you can kind of explain that a little bit.
Oh, yeah. Oh, thank you for that. Yeah, it's so each one of those local Purim, they local Purims, they were celebrated on different days, sometimes very close to Purim, like the 20th of Adar or 21st of Adar. And so they often they're very close, but not always. Sometimes most of the time they're put on a Rosh Chodesh on the new month, but so they don't always correspond to a specific date of an historical event. But yeah, Purim refers to the Jewish holiday, so that is commemorated by all Jews, be it from Yemen or Ashkenaz or Sepharad or Ramaniot or whatever. But then there are so that's the holiday that we know as being Purim. But Purim takes on a context beyond just that limited scope of the holiday commemorating the deeds of Esther and Mordecai, but also to describe any event in which Jews were rescued from certain danger. And so that's the implication of Purim. And so that's the term that's used because of the idea of like, and the reason it's a fitting term is because of the very name Purim kind of denotes a kind of chance involved. And so in each of these events, there's a certain amount of chance that through which Jews are rescued from certain danger. So that's why the term Purim is used, and because of all of its cultural meanings. So yeah, sometimes I think they're called Purim Katan or Purim Sheni. I think I've heard both, but I'm not sure about that. Yeah, but sometimes they're given that kind of qualifier, a small Purim or a secondary Purim.
Got it. There's a question in the chat from Patricia Schaller who says, I may have missed it. Haman was the evil man who convinced the king to kill the Jews. Esther convinced him to save the Jews. What role did Haman's sons, children have in the Esther story, or where did they come into being hanged? Like, where did that?
Well, they were complicit, and they colluded with Haman to carry out the decree. So it was Haman and all of his family were wiped out.
So was that if you read the Book of Esther, the complicity of his children in
that's a good question. I don't remember exactly how much their complicity is. I'm going to be reminded in a couple of days when I hear the scroll of Esther read in the synagogue. So yeah, ask me again then when my memory is refreshed. It's either because they were complicit or because they were just part of the general killing that Jews did. And when the decree was not that it was reversed, because an imperial decree can't be reversed once it's issued. The reversal of fortunes was that a second decree was issued that allowed the Jews to perform self-defense, but to kill willingly whatever Persians they liked. So so they were either killed as complicit or they were killed as part of the general Jewish killing of all their persecutors. But it's a good question. I'd have to go back and look at the text, which I probably should have done preparation for this, but I didn't want to ruin it for Purim that's coming just on the pike. So
okay, there's 3 questions in the Q&A. Do you want me to read them to you?
Or yeah, if you don't mind, until I find them. Yeah.
What is the basis of any depiction of Vashti's beheading, as there's absolutely no mention of her fate in the text?
Oh, good question. Yeah, that's a really good question. I don't know the answer. There's a lot of midrashic elements surrounding what was the relationship between Mordecai and Esther exactly. There's a lot of elements of the Purim story that are left up to midrashic elements.
Yeah.
So it'd be interesting to see in which tradition, the Pirkei de Eliezer or something, some midrashic text in which that might give that answer, because I don't really know, but that's at least the iconographic tradition for sure.
Okay, and that was Nissan Hershkowitz.
Thank you, Nissan. Good question. I wish I had all of your questions. I'm just excited about this material like you are. So, if you have answers to these questions, I feel free to butt in to answer them.
Clyde Hertig says, very entertaining and enlightening. I'm amazed, although I suppose I shouldn't be, regarding your comments about Reform Judaism making the holiday politically correct.
Yes, this is a very interesting, this is something that reformers were, so it should be noted, I think, that some of the reformers, especially in 1840, at the time of the synods in Breslau and Frankfurt, the issue of getting rid of some holidays was very much central to what was being debated, like certain things were undeniable that you should get rid of them, like Kol Nidre. They universally wanted to scrap Kol Nidre because it looked like Jews, that's not particularly a holiday, but it's a liturgy associated with Yom Kippur, because it looked like Jews were making oaths in court and all year round, and then going to synagogue and breaking them. So, and even some of the neo-Orthodox, like Samson Raphael Hirsch, also wanted to abolish Kol Nidre. So, if they're willing to get rid of that, Purim was very much central to. So, in classical reform, Purim is very much not part of the practice of Judaism, and particularly for these offensive elements, and for its violent elements, but also for its very un-Protestant demeanor. It's a holiday associated with a lot of noise making, hooting and hollering, rioting and drinking. This is not the way that the reformers, at least in German lands, had envisioned Judaism progressing and evolving. They wanted to make it more, they wanted to add an element of decorum to the practice of Judaism. So really, Purim was anathema to everything they viewed as being Jewish, and there were some attempts to abolish Purim totally, but I think that the more common position was to reform it and to kind of do away with the more raucous elements. There's a rather famous essay, I think, by Claude Montefiore, who was one of the great ideologues of Reform Judaism, humanistic Judaism in England in the late 19th century, and he wrote quite a famous essay about reforming Purim so that it was more decorous.
But it seems like it didn't take. I mean,
I don't think it did.
It's very much a part of Reform Judaism today, and so is Kol Nidre, actually. But
totally, that's Kol Nidre is the one thing that puzzles me. I'd be very curious to learn at what point Kol Nidre becomes quite mainstream again. When it was kind of universally hated by the original reformers, as was Purim. But even Hanukkah, there's some debate about getting rid of Hanukkah. The Talmudic rabbis seem not to have liked Hanukkah very much to begin with. And but also of its violent themes, it's overly rabbinic. I mean, and it has, it's not something that should be commemorated, because it's like ultimately something that depicts the Jews killing other Jews, which is the essence of that war that's being described in Maccabees 1 and 2.
And what do you think, this is also from Clyde, what do you think the actual historical events were?
Good question. I'm sure that there's some really good research about this. I'm not dismissive of the question, but I think that the actual historical events are rooted in the, I don't know, I probably think that this is a Hasmonean era text, Hellenistic text. That's using this kind of pseudepigraphic elements, or attributing it to an earlier period to describe events that are happening in their own time. So in that sense, it might have a lot to say about Hanukkah as well. the scroll of Esther. I don't know. I'm not really a Bible scholar, so I can't say with any certainty that's the case. But the historical events that we could point to was the Achaemenid Persians had unseated the Babylonians, and they had used religious ideologies in order to do that. And part of that was so they incorporated Babylonian gods and Babylonian languages and things like that, and they restored the people of Judah to a Persian, to a satrapy, which is a Persian province. So, and this is the stories that permeate probably the Persian era texts of Ezra and Nehemiah, describing the descendants of the kings, Sheshbatzar, Zerubbabel, returning to the land of Israel to create the second Commonwealth, and then followed by the priest Ezra and scribe, and the political leader of Nehemiah. So those are the historical events that are well attributed to in archaeologically and textually. But I think that the names Esther and Mordecai are probably rooted in more Babylonian traditions. Marduk, Ishtar, perhaps they're not, definitely not indigenously Jewish. I don't know. I don't know for sure, but that's the best I can do about the historical context of the Purim story. I'm sure there's been some, there's some real research out there about this, and I just don't know it.
So Daniel Stein-Koken commented and said, I was struck by the worm's Moxor image of the hanging of Haman's children. It reminded me of the medieval iconography of the Jesse tree.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that's there's some good. I don't think it's Cogman Appel. Somebody has written about this very thing that you're talking about, Daniel. The idea of using the same kind of Christian motifs to depict the hanging of Haman, almost identical. To what you're describing. So this isn't that's interesting, but I would say though that so I don't know if that the image of the hangings are necessarily also indigenous to Jewish to Jewish artists. There might be Christian influence there, or was it a Jewish influence? I don't know if it was Jewish influence on Christian themes, but one thing I can say for sure, I think that this motif has a much longer life in the Jewish world than in the Christian.
Got it. Will Linden says, in Barbara Bennery's Wayang Esther, it is revealed that Vashti was not killed, but secretly retired to her villa near Babylon.
Well, that's good for Vashti. That makes me feel better. She deserved it. She deserved to be retired and not killed. I think she was. I think she's probably the one of the most heroic characters in the Esther story. That and also the eunuchs, I think, are also very heroic and underappreciated. So hopefully they got to join Vashti in her villa, because I think that there's some unsung heroes of the Esther story, but we Jews tend to focus more on Esther and Mordecai. But there's other praiseworthy characters as well.
Couldn't agree more about Vashti. Nissan Hershkovitz would like you to comment on Martin Luther and Purim Fest.
Yes, I think I know what you're talking about. This is, but I'm not sure. Some Protestants, including Michaelis later on, Johann Michaelis, had described Jews as being vengeful and used Purim as this evidence of Jewish vengefulness and vindictiveness, and so Purim became this model for Jews were were being vindictive on Purim. At least that's the essay, that's the theory, the thesis, I would say, of one of the great books on this topic, which I took a lot of this material from. Elliot Horowitz's Reckless Rights, an absolutely phenomenal book if you want to read like a great history that just spans just about every era, and just expert his history, and written beautifully. So I believe he talks about this. And his thesis in that book is that it wasn't just Christian imagination that made the Jews vindictive. That vindictiveness was a legitimate aspect of Purim, the manifestation of Purim celebrations. So yeah, I think that I believe that might be what you're talking about, but I apologize if I didn't quite nail it for you. I don't know. What was there? Are there other questions here? Did I lose you guys?
Sorry, it's nope, that's it. That was the end of the questions. Unless Daniel wanted to come back with anything, or
yeah, Daniel, do you want to add anything?
You know what? Yeah, Daniel, if you want to add anything, I can allow you to talk. Nope, he's not responding. So he's happy with you, I guess.
Okay, good.
There's one more question, I think. Oh, Nissan.
He's probably, I bet Daniel is at Vashti's retirement villa.
Nissan says you nailed it. Also, Purim Fest was the last word of Julius Streicher.
Oh, okay.
Did I pronounce that
very
right?
interesting. Oh, I'm not even looking at, Lisa, I'm so glad you're doing this, because I'm not, okay. Yeah, also Purim Fest is the last word of Julius. Okay, very interesting. Thank you very much for that, Nissan. I appreciate that.
And Daniel's good.
Okay, yeah, I see Daniel. He's out there by the Bay Shore, by the Caspian Sea.
Exactly.
Great.
Thank you very
Right.
much. This has been wonderful. I think hopefully our audience feels the same way. And as usual, we've had some great questions from the audience. And we hope you'll join us on March 27th, and continue to look at our website, which is jewishstudies.asu.edu, to see other programs that we're offering. Our year is kind of coming to an end, but we will be back. We have programs through the end of May, and then we'll be back in the fall with a full lineup of programs, most of which will continue to be on Zoom, because we get such great turnout on Zoom, and so many of you from all over the country seem to be able to join us this way. But there will be also some public programming in person. So thanks again, and thank you, Stanley. You were wonderful.
Thank you, Lisa. Thank you, everybody, for coming out.